We see your presenter view, Dr. Arita.
This is always the problem I have with this thing. Um,
You might be able to switch the view.
okay, you know exactly how I do that. So okay.
All right. So thank you everyone for joining us today for the Trade and Tariff Policy Impacts webinar. Our presenter today is Dr. Shawn Arita, Associate Director of the Agricultural Risk Policy Center at North Dakota State University. He previously served as Senior Economist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Office of the Chief Economist, where he led key analyses for USDA farm programs. Dr. Arita is widely recognized for his expertise in agricultural policy, agricultural commodity markets, economic modeling, and impact assessment. We're excited to welcome him and gain from his extensive experience. If you have questions today, please drop them into the chat so we can address them later. But at this point, I will turn it over to Dr. Rita. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lacey. And again, pleasure to be here virtually for this webinar. So I'm going to do actually, I have sort of a two-part presentation now. So initially, I was just going to talk about tariff and trade policy impacts, which I will. But another thing that has, of course, since shockwaves to our commodity markets recently has been the Strait of Hormuz. And so let me quickly talk about that point because, again, it feeds much into a lot of the supply chain issues, a lot of the trade issues that are affecting around the whole world, including our US farmers. So I do have a whole bunch of slides here. I'm actually going to try to go through them as quickly as possible. In the meantime, anybody feel free to raise questions throughout the talk. It's hard for me to see the chat box, so if anybody has questions, maybe just unmic themselves and shout it out. Okay, so very quickly, we know that we've had this major disruption, February 27th, following some joint airstrikes against Iran. Iran retaliated, including of which was drone attacks against tankers. That, as we all know, has led to an effective shutdown of commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz that still continues right now. Doesn't seem to have a clear end in sight. This has sent ripple effects throughout the economy. Oil prices shooting up more than $100. We've seen the stock market be affected as well. For agriculture, um, the most direct effect on the agriculture has been our supply chains through fertilizers. And so, as we know, this region is, again, not only a major energy producer, natural gas producer, but they are one of the most central producers for fertilizers, particularly nitrogen-based fertilizers, because they are such a major region for natural gas, which is the key input for nitrogen fertilizer. So they account for about 43% of the urea global exports, 27% of anhydrous ammonia, and about 16% of phosphates for MAP and DAP type of exports. And additionally, they also account for almost half the world's sulfur, and sulfur is a key feedstock needed for phosphate fertilizers. You need the sulfuric acid to process the phosphate rock to make MAP and DAP. So this is going to have potential cascading effects as well. And then you also have these secondary effects where some of these regions like Egypt, they have gas pipelines, they are cut off, which they essentially have to suspend their urea production. And you're seeing this even broader beyond this region as well, with many regions having difficulties getting natural gas, and they're therefore suspending their operations of nitrogen fertilizers. Here's a map showing fertilizer outflows of the region to the world. So the US, we import about 2 million metric tons of fertilizers from the Persian Gulf region. Most of this is urea as well as MAP and DAP supply. Saudi Arabia is one of our key suppliers of fertilizers. But you will also notice that and in fact, many of these other regions and some of our key competitors, it's fair to say that they're more dependent, more exposed to being dependent upon the Persian Gulf supply. So Brazil, for instance, um, they rely on Persian Gulf supply about 4.4 million metric tons of their fertilizer. India is the world's largest fertilizer importer. They 9.7 million of their fertilizers come from the Persian Gulf region. Um, so how exposed are we to Hormuz? So we actually do produce most of the fertilizers we get on the nitrogen side are actually procured from domestic production. The US, again, we produce a lot of natural gas. We produce a lot of ammonia, anhydrous, UAN, different type of fertilizers. The two that we are most exposed for is urea, so 12%. This is how much we rely on the Gulf region, and MAP and DAP, 17%. Um, I had mentioned sulfur. This is another thing to watch because you need sulfur to make MAP and DAP. And most of half of the world's supply of sulfur is really exported to Morocco and China, which together they use to make those two countries are in turn the largest exporters of phosphate fertilizers. So you have this potential concerning cascading effects where you have less sulfur. We do worry whether that's going to translate to curtailment of phosphate production from our major suppliers. And this is happening at a terrible time because phosphate has already been tight. China for years has been, they've been having export restrictions on their phosphate side due to competing demands for EVs and batteries. They're about 50% down from what they would be. Also, too, on the nitrogen side, um, it's already been very lingering effects from the ongoing Russia and Ukraine conflict. So here's a chart showing fertilizer prices. Um, this is already outdated. This is from last week. You have seen these prices stick up a little further. Um, Again, an important point to recognize is that even before the Strait of Hormuz, prices were very, very pressured, very, very high. They are not at the levels we've seen during Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2022, but we did see record prices. But they are, in terms of affordability, if you look at it as a ratio of the corn or soybean price, it is on the MAP and DAP side, it is even more unaffordable than what we're looking at now. Um, and so here is just so how bad is things going to get? We don't know. So the main thing is nobody knows. The key question mark is when the Strait of Hormuz will reopen. And so again, could that be could that be a few short weeks? Could that be a few even longer? That's the big wild card. We don't know. Um, Looking back at the last time we've seen a major crisis on fertilizers in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, we did see fertilizer prices surge upwards of 40% for urea and MAP and DAP and potash. Potash about 20%. Now, Russia and Belarus, like the Persian Gulf region, major suppliers of fertilizers, primarily on the potash side, but they make up globally about 12%. And when you look at N, P, and K, the major fertilizer nutrients, for the Gulf, if you include sulfur, you're looking at upwards of about one-third of the world's fertilizers flowing out of the Strait of Hormuz. So pound for pound, Hormuz is a much more larger source of supply. Additionally, we did see a lot of the fertilizers throughout the conflict. They did keep flowing through out of Russia and Belarus. They found rerouted. They were able to get. There was logistical challenges, but they were able to get most of the fertilizers out. Um, Right now, we're looking at a physical blockage. I mean, right now, commercial vessels aren't flowing out. And so there, again, and plants are suspending operations. So it is a big. Um, so we can potentially see a much more severe fertilizer supply crunch if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. On the flip side, though, of course, Russia and Ukraine, major grain exporters, Persian Gulf, not really, they don't really supply. Um, they're not a food supplier, they're not a grain supplier. So we did see food price spike in 2022. We are seeing upward pressure in corn, soybeans, and soybean oil, but this is not as severe because you're not looking at a supply shock on the grain side. But again, these are more indirect effects due to higher fertilizer prices, higher fuel prices. So for farmers, um, you're looking at a much different circumstance where you can potentially see rising fertilizer prices, but you're not going to see that offsetting increase on the revenue side through higher grain prices. And that leads you to a much different um, that can lead you to a much different situation when you're talking about margins, which we know have been very challenging for most of the row crops. But now I'm going to move on to tariffs. Again, if anybody had any questions on the fertilizers or Hormuz, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm going to quickly shift gears a bit and talk about tariffs. Any quick questions from anybody, or should I just keep going on? Okay, so on the tariff side, okay, so tariffs, as we know, very it's been a very tumultuous period, to say the least, in terms of tariffs. Um, Under President Trump, tariffs have risen, they've been pulled back, then they've risen again, and you have all these type of trade discussions and negotiations going on. It's really hard to keep track of this. I first want to start off with just kind of giving some background of why we are here, where the situation we are today. So here's um, here's some charts giving us over 200 years of history of tariffs. So tariffs again serve primarily three objectives from a policymaker standpoint. The first objective is they are a source of revenue, as we all know. And so when our country was first started, we didn't have our government didn't have any way to collect revenues. And the first major tool that they used was tariffs. So at the start of the founding of our country, from tariffs is the easiest way to collect revenue. You collect it from imported goods. Um, and then over time, these tariffs shifted in priority as we moved to, through the second half of the 19th century. Looking at this period, there was this objective to use tariffs to protect the domestic industry. At that time, in the North, there was this interest of protecting the infant industry from competition from Europe in terms of manufacturing goods, and so they raised tariffs to just mainly as to protect it from competition. And then moving to the post-World War I and II era, it shifted a bit. U.S. was a much more developed economy at that time. After the World War II, it was by far the most important economy, the most advanced. And so the objective shifted. The U.S. sought open markets. And so at this point, the U.S. was their objective was to cut tariffs across not only theirs, but across the world. But in terms of tariffs, what they served is ultimately as a bargaining chip, or using this theme of the three R's, reciprocity. And that is, you want other countries to lower their tariffs so that it gives us export opportunities, like for our agricultural goods. But the only way that you can do that is by lowering your own. So whenever there's a trade negotiation, that's how it plays out. It's just like, well, if you want us to lower our tariffs, what are you going to do in return? It's always quid pro quo. So this age, it really focused on this reciprocity. And these are some things to keep in mind. So the president has often said that tariffs are the most beautiful word in the dictionary. You can see the appeal that he sees in it too. It generates revenue. It can help protect us from imported goods. And then it also serves as a useful bargaining chip. And all of these things, he's using it to that extent that we've never seen. And I'll get to what we're seeing now in terms of the IEEPA tariffs and SCOTUS ruling very quickly. So we had this very rise of globalization over the past 2 or 3 decades. Um, at the same time, we've seen China just really develop rapidly. It was just, a story of just very rapid development going on in China. They entered the WTO. The US, so this red line shows what we were importing, all goods. These are all goods that we've import over China. When they first entered the WTO, they're about 100 billion. In recent years, they're like $500 billion that we import. During the same time, we have seen that our manufacturing sector has suffered under this. And a lot of economists too, really hadn't paid much attention to this feature, thinking that trade just benefits everybody. But um, further subsequent studies said, hey, they call it the China shock, where they estimated millions of job losses due to higher competition from China, due to increasing amount of imports. There was a lot of plant closures. So I mentioned this because there has been sort of this underlying uh, backlash to trade due to, again, increasing competition from China that has affected job losses. There has been frustrations at the WTO as well, where some countries aren't really playing by the rules. China is one highlighted, a lot of subsidies that there was this vision that when they entered the WTO, everybody would trade and would have a very rule-based system and everybody would be better off. Well, it's been a lot more complicated than that. Um, there's been clear frustrations on the US side. Now, this preceded the Trump administration, even the Obama administration had a lot of issues with the WTO. And that continued further under the Trump administration, even the Biden administration on top of that. So that I mentioned all that because that kind of sets the tone of what we're looking at now. And President Trump, in some ways, embodies some of that, that lingering kind of frustrations against trade. And so he came again in his second term, promised to raise tariffs, and that's exactly what he did. He did not disappoint on that front. Um, Immediately upon setting office, raised for fentanyl-related tariffs on Canada and Mexico back in February. Again, few weeks on the job, raising tariffs, and then Liberation Day, April 2025, raised their tariffs to the highest we've seen in like a century. And then through the process, there's all these trade deals going on too that I'll touch upon. That you see these tariffs moving up and moving down, deals with China and so forth. And then, of course, ultimately, we did see that Supreme Court ruling last month. So those tariffs were taken off, but then they were quickly replaced by Section 122 tariffs that are currently in place now. So these reciprocal tariffs, or so the IEEPA tariffs, again, first they start off with a 10% baseline, but then for some countries they're upwards of 50%, like on Brazil and India. And then you had, countries like China, more than 30%, and across the board, very, very high tariffs. Um, and then at the same time, we also faced higher tariffs in retaliation for raising our own tariffs under IEEPA. And so the issue is whenever we get into these trade conflicts or trade wars that I think it's fair to call that this period now, agriculture is always the first one in the crosshairs. So when countries are upset at us for raising our tariffs on them, they want to retaliate. The first sector that they target is agriculture. They know that agriculture is an area that they can hurt. So we saw that in 2018 and 2019 during the first trade war. At that time, we were retaliated by China, Canada, Mexico, EU, India, and Turkey. Um, and so moving into 2025, there was wide concern that when we start raising all our tariffs on all these countries, that all of them are going to retaliate against us. Interestingly, though, even though we raised our tariffs much more broadly in 2025 than in 2026, only two countries really have retaliated against us directly. One was Canada, but they actually removed their tariffs back in September. The other one is China. And so China, though, when they retaliate very, very aggressively, very broad base, and they hit us hard in terms of our agriculture. That's what they did in 2018, and that's what they're doing in 2025. So you can see that virtually all of our sectors face some level of retaliatory tariff in the Chinese market in response to the IEEPA tariffs that we had imposed throughout last year. And so soybeans right now faces a 13% tariff. Now, this was, again, we had a trade truce. At one point, it was 23%. There's also these other tariffs too, like Section 301 and others that are officially on the books, but China is not actually charging us at this point. But I mentioned that, so there's still some of these tariffs from the first Trump administration that the Biden administration carried on, which is like the Section 232 tariffs that China still imposes on us. And so for pork, U.S. pork exporters, they face a 46% tariff right now in the Chinese market. Nuts, about 27%. Some of these other products, about 11%. And this is again after some of the truce that had gone on back in November of 2025. Um, so if you just look at our performance of exports in 2025 to the Chinese market, we are down 76% relative to the 3-year average before that. So in other words, typically we export about $15 billion of soybeans to China. Last year, we exported about $3 billion. Um, Corn, we haven't exported any to China hasn't been buying corn, so these may be some reasons outside of the tariffs themselves. But if you look at across the board, you can see that every single one of our commodities were down significantly in terms of exports to China last year. This is just using the full calendar year 2025 data, down 76%. Soybeans plummeted, corn and wheat zero. Sorghum is one hit really, really hard. Pork down 23%, beef down 29%. Um, we, again, during this time, one of the things we saw is our basis just collapsed back in November. China wasn't buying our soybeans. We saw particularly in the upper Midwest, North Dakota, soybeans, cash prices below 850. Again, this region is so dependent upon that P&W pipeline and shipping out to China. Without China there, basis had very, very much weakened. They did pick back up though after the trade truce when China started buying. Here's a chart showing our soybean export sales to China. So we can remember that for much of 2025, China was not even was not doing any purchasing of our soybeans. And then we had the November truce. Part of that, um, China pledged to buy 12 million metric tons of soybeans. Um, and I think many of us were a bit skeptical that they would buy all of this by the end of the year, but by moving, they did extend the deadline, but by January, they seem to have fulfilled their commitments, particularly, again, some of the data between China and unknown, but it seems pretty clear that they have reached their commitments for the 12 million metric tons back in January. President Trump has mentioned that China has pledged an additional 8 million metric tons. So we'll also see how that plays out. And then on top of that, for the next 2 marketing years, China's committed to buy an additional 25 million metric tons. One interesting thing we have seen is that China has been purchasing all these soybeans over the past few months, paying a premium, a significant premium over Brazilian soybeans, which is a bit unusual since China typically just buys the cheapest soybean the landed price. When Brazil's soybeans are cheaper, they typically just buy Brazilian soybeans. What we have seen, though, is that following the truce, China's been willing to pay above market prices for U.S. soybeans. And so they seem to be genuinely committed to making these targets, the 12 million. We'll see about the 8 million. And then moving forward, there's that 25 million metric ton commitment. We've seen how the export flows have reshuffled you see this reshuffling of the deck in terms of where soybeans are going. Um, so, typically, this is just to the February marketing year to date, but typically in previous years, we sent about half of our soybean exports to China, and the other half to these other countries. This year, though, we were down by, these include the sales and the shipments, we call it the commitments. We were down by about 10.5 million metric tons to China. We did send a lot more soybeans to our markets outside of China, and that was up from about 23 to 30 million metric tons. Brazil rediverts a lot of their soybeans to China. So Brazil, the vast majority of their soybeans go to China. They're a lot more, they're really a China-driven market in that sense. But you can see how the tariff has led us to decimated our exports to China. We make up in other markets. Brazil does the opposite. The other side that the tariffs have affected us is through our agricultural inputs. And so we're not only again facing retaliatory tariffs, they also affect us through higher production costs because our inputs now face higher levels of tariffs. And so here, this is a map, at least for the IEEPA tariffs. We import, again, a lot of tractors and machinery from Europe and Asia, fertilizers, chemicals, pesticides, and seeds all over the world. All of this has been more expensive due to the IEEPA tariffs, with the exception of Canada as well as Mexico, which are largely exempt under USMCA. So here's a chart just showing how much our tariffs had increased for key agricultural inputs. So typically speaking, our inputs before 2025 were very low, about 1%. This is the MFN tariff shown in green. This is what we used to pay normally speaking before the IEEPA tariffs were imposed. When the IEEPA tariffs were imposed, we were paying upwards of a 9% tariff on all of our inputs. And so this is the aggregate. We import about $33 billion of all of these goods. So these are machinery parts, tractors, nitrogen, potash, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, insecticides, seeds, these selected inputs. I'm not even including steel and aluminum and other things that have tariffs, but if you just include these inputs, about $33 billion that we import. When the IEEPA tariffs were imposed, those tariffs raised from about 1% to about 9% effectively, accounting for exemptions like Canada and Mexico and other products. So for everything we're importing, it was about increased to 9%. Supreme Court strikes down IEEPA tariffs. So that lowers the tariffs we face, but then the White House imposes Section 122 tariffs. And so that's 10%. But again, keep in mind that a lot of goods are still exempt. Like actually the fertilizers were exempt starting in November. And then again, Canada and Mexico goods, they don't face the tariff. So effectively, we are looking now, after the Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariffs from 9%, now we're looking at roughly a 6% tariff from the original 1% that we faced before 2025. And this varies across. We can see that For instance, pesticides, you can see upwards of a 12%, and some of these fungicides, herbicides, insecticides too, they face high levels of tariffs, whereas the fertilizers are largely exempt. We had tabulated the total amount of revenue collected surrounding these IEEPA tariffs back last year. It was amount to about $1 billion, so 5 to 600 million for farm machinery, 273 million for ag chemicals, about 100 million for fertilizers, 44 million for seeds. So the 100 million doesn't really sound too large when you factor in that total IEEPA tariffs are on the level of 160 to 180 billion dollars. But one thing we do point out is that these tariffs, the economic costs to farmers are much more than just the size of the tariff revenue themselves. And the reason is because when tariffs go up, they don't just raise the price of what's being imported, but because they narrow the set of competition that is being faced through a lot of these foreign suppliers, they no longer supply the market when they face these higher tariffs, then that allows domestic fertilizer suppliers to also raise their price so that even those products become more expensive. And so ultimately, that leads to higher overall prices for these fertilizers for farmers. And we saw that during this period when the IEEPA tariffs were in effect. And so here in this window, these were where the tariffs were in effect. What we did see is that the fertilizer prices our farmers paid, like in the northern plains, like in the Dakotas region. Um, so normally it's not too much different than what Canadian farmers paid just across the border. But then during this period, you did see our premiums did pick up significantly, about $50 expansion per metric ton of the premiums that we saw during this window that has subsequently converged after the tariff was later exempt back in November of 2025. So this is just examples from DAP and MAP. And so here, what we mentioned was that the pass-through rate of the tariffs were extremely high. So that's the pass-through rate. That's what is passed through from the importer to the end user, which is the farmer. Effectively, it was about 100% pass-through. And so for other products, this can vary. You can see that pass-through at the border is usually about 100%, but when you go to the end user, like a consumer at Walmart importing or buying cheap toys from China or whatnot. With higher tariffs, you may see about 20 or 80% pass-through rate. But for some products, you can see upwards of 100 pass-through rate through the end user, in which case this is the farmer. And that's what we saw in fertilizers. So, this is a very sticky point now because now we know that we know that refunds are in order for all of these um, IEEPA tariffs. The court has ordered that refunds have to be issued. $160 billion of refunds, biggest refund in history. Um, but legally speaking, it seems like, again, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems like the only real mechanism that these refunds can be issued is to the importer, not the end user. And so all of these refunds are presumably going to go to the importer that also had largely passed along the cost to the end user, like the farmer in this case. And that would leave them essentially with a windfall of these refunds. And so this is what's going to make a lot of these it's not going to be fair in terms of how these refunds are ultimately issued because it's not going to who actually bore the burden of the tariff. Um, okay, so one other thing I wanted to talk about was in the midst of all of these trade discussions, there has been very active work by the White House to sign new trade deals. And so I mentioned earlier that that third R I talked about. Um, what was it? Reciprocity. right? So for trade negotiations, we are always wanting to open up new markets to have our markets lower their tariffs. Now, in order to do that, we have to offer something in return, and that's to lower our tariffs. One of the challenges we have seen is that from the US side, we've been lowering our tariffs very steadily for much of the last century, half of the century. Um, and so we were effectively, before Trump re-entered office, at a 2% overall tariff. And so, I mean, that's great. It opens up markets, but then when it comes to trade negotiations, you have less bargaining chips in your corner. And so one of the things about the Trump trade strategy, though, is by raising these tariffs, you create what you call leverage. That means you now have much more to negotiate on your side when you want your other partners to lower their tariffs. So now instead of saying, well, if we lower yours, and I mean, if that they'll lower theirs, if we lower ours, and we didn't really have much to lower, now we actually do have something to lower. And so this leverage was part of their strategy that they've been leveraging to sign trade deals on the side. So you have all these countries, and now we have all these higher tariffs on them. They don't like that. And so in return, that actually does get them to the table. Not just China. So the only reason why China's, playing ball, of course, with us is because we have all these high tariffs on their products. They don't like that. And that's the only reason why they're willing to make commitments for soybeans and other products on the agriculture side, and also discuss more complicated issues like critical rare earth mineral exports on top of that. If we don't have this, you know, it's about carrots and sticks. If you didn't have this stick of the tariff, then they wouldn't be talking to us, right? So on the side too, again, we've been making a lot of trade deals with other uh, countries as well, signing deals with Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Guatemala, El Salvador. There have been these purchase commitments. Japan has pledged to buy $8 billion of ag purchases. You had Indonesia pledging to buy billions of dollars of soybean products. Vietnam, Thailand, United Kingdom. So this is one part of the coin of the White House trade strategy. Again, we'll see how this ultimately all plays out. I mean, you have seen a lot of movement on this front because even before this administration, there wasn't really too much going on in terms of the trade negotiations, whereas now you do have a lot of talking on that front. Um, so that kind of leads us to sort of, where we are now, and that is we've Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, by striking down the IEEPA tariffs, right, um, that does impair the trade strategy because you lose leverage by not having the tariffs as a bargaining chip. And so that is partly why we saw as soon as the Supreme Court struck down those tariffs, the White House the very next day used a totally different tool, um, Section 122. Um, that's the 10% tariff that we see now. Now, the issue with Section 122, though, is that you only have 4 months, 120 days before before Congress has to approve of it. And in this climate, we're not going to expect Congress to approve 122. So effectively, it's going to expire July 24th. And at that point, we've already can't do IEPA. It's unconstitutional. Section 122, that's supposed to be a bridge that to keep the tariffs on. I mean, from the White House standpoint, so you can keep doing the trade deal making, but then to also go to Plan B, which is Section 301. And so Section 301, these are it's a statutory authority that allows USTR to investigate and impose tariffs due to unfair trade practices. And so unfair foreign trade practices can be a very, very broad term. And so you can use that under different circumstances. Back in 2018, against China, that's the authorities we used. We put on tariffs on China by using Section 301, saying that they were doing unfair foreign trade practices in terms of tech transfer. They were forcing our companies to, in order to do business by giving up their technology to China. And that's how we levied a whole bunch of tariffs back then. Now, just last week, the White House launched two new investigations. One is against structural excess capacity. So that is all of these subsidies that these other markets may be doing for things like steel and alumina, I mean, steel and metals and shipbuilding and autos, and saying that these are unfair. And we are going to um, conduct this investigation to determine whether it's unfair, and then ultimately to impose tariffs on you because of these unfair practices. The second investigation is forced labor failures. So that is for countries that are not themselves doing the forced labor, but are importing products that have used forced labor. And and the US does have a very, very strong laws and regulations against importation of products with using forced labor. And so this investigation is saying, well, if other countries aren't abiding by that same level of standards we are, that's unfair because that gives them a competitive advantage because they're using cheaper labor. And so they've launched this against 60 economies. Now, critics would say that they are doing this not because they're using these two as reasons as an excuse simply to replace the IEEPA tariffs that were previously imposed. And, that's probably a fair criticism. I mean, we've heard the White House say that they basically are going to replace these IEEPA tariffs. And so it does seem pretty clear that's sort of the strategy that they're undertaking. These two authorities. So the reason why there's many of these different authorities that the president can use, but IEPA was very, very appealing because you could do it very quickly. You don't need any investigation. You can just declare some kind of emergency and you can just hit these tariffs. And that's why they went with that action. But of course, the Supreme Court determined that that was unconstitutional, that IEPA wasn't intended to be used in that way. And so now they're reverting to this backup option, which they call it more legally durable because you do launch a formal investigation and you do go through this process. And in fact, in 2018, there was companies that sued saying that the Section 301 tariffs were not, were not legally that they were unjustified, but that but those lawsuits lost. I mean, so basically, the courts upheld Section 301 back in 2018. So it does have, again, a much better standing now. The way that they're doing it now is still rather questionable. We'll see whether it can be upheld. But again, the other major issue with it takes a while. So typically it takes about 12 months to do these investigations. The White House says that they want to do it. Normal timeline is 12 months. White House says they want to do it in 4 months. And it's clear why they want to do it in 4 months because Section 122 tariffs expires in 4 months. Um, so, so again, so, um, okay, so one other thing to mention, USMCA. This is another issue. Um, we are hitting, it's up for its 5-year review. This is a big one. Again, China is not our largest market. Canada and Mexico are our largest agricultural export markets. That's where we send most of our corn on the export front, fresh produce. livestock products, soybeans. Um, this is clearly um, something that the sector is sees as being extremely important, and has been a very ag sector has benefited heavily from this deal. So this is up for review. Now, um, there could be several outcomes. So they could potentially extend it completely, and that actually they'll grant it for 16 years. Now, the White House has already said that they're not about to do that because they don't want this to just be given a green rubber stamp, and that it doesn't allow them to review it in subsequent years. So most likely is that they will withhold a full-on permanent or 16-year extension and do it where way it still stays fully enforced but have mandatory annual reviews. But there is the worst case scenario where if negotiations fall through and the deal gets scuttled, then we can revert back to these MFN rates, and that would be disastrous for the ag sector. So this is again happening right now as well. So this is what we're seeing. It's a very full slate lineup in terms of trade policy actions. We even have these CVD duties on fertilizers that I didn't even talk about. But what we're looking at now is you have, again, ongoing discussions with China. Um, the president was supposed to meet with China's President Xi Jinping at the end of the month, but now with the Strait of Hormuz, that might be delayed. And in fact, that's why we saw soybean prices, futures, um, take a little nosedive today, in fact. Um, and because everybody was hearing, well, some of the negotiations going on with Secretary Bessent as well as Ambassador Jameson Greer, who's currently discussing with the Chinese in Paris. Those seem to have been going well, and they've been potentially promising more agricultural purchases outside of soybeans. Um, that so, anyways, continued uncertainty. Will China make its 25 million metric tons commitment? Will they buy more products? Um, we know when China starts buying that, that really does support our commodity prices. So that's one thing to watch. And then we have again these Section 301 issues. This is again the long-term backup plan for what the White House wants to replace from the IEEPA tariffs. That's going on. We have the USMCA review. July, Section 122 tariffs, 10% right now. They expire. October 30th, right now we don't have a deal with China. I mean, they call it a framework agreement, but it's really a truce. That's 1 year. And if things go sour, we can see those China tariffs ratchet up even higher than they do. We also have these other things like Section 301, maritime fees, that's also affecting agriculture. Um, and so, we're seeing this on both ends, both retaliatory tariffs as well as IEEPA tariffs. We know that right now the biggest challenge that our farm sector on the crop side is the fact that production costs are too high, right? That's the biggest challenge. Um, and commodity prices are too low. So here, this is my last slide, but just again, so the red line, this is a USDA NAS a production cost indice. Um, this has all the production costs from land, fertilizers, machinery, seeds, chemical. Everything is captured in this in terms of overall production costs for the crop sector. The green line, what I show is NASA's price indice for the crop prices that farmers receive. So this is a weighted average of corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, cotton, all of the major crops. Weighted average in this green line. So as we can recall, we did see that that back in 2022, we had a commodity price spike, right? Corn, soybeans, all commodity prices were going up. Russia, this is the time Russia invaded Ukraine. So that wasn't the only reason, but again, we had weaker global supply, strong demand from China and other markets too at that time. It was a La Nina year. Brazil's supply wasn't that great either. And then you had Russia invade Ukraine. And then we saw all commodity prices going up, including fertilizer prices went through the roof. Um, and so, okay, so this is let me at least make it clear that this is for 2020 or for 2011. It's indexed through there. So don't look straight up at the differences between these two lines, but look at just how they're changing. But what we do know is that crop prices shot up, production costs also shot up. But of course, in 2023, crop prices pulled back, production costs stayed high. You had your price cost squeeze, right? Production costs keep staying elevated, commodity prices pull back. You're looking at negative margins at that time. And now we're about 3 years in a downward commodity price spike, commodity price cycle. And so this is our third consecutive year of looking at negative net losses on the crop side. Production costs still stay high. I did mark 2025 when these tariffs were first put into effect. I marked that because, again, a lot of attention has been paid to the tariffs, but the situation we are in now far preceded the tariffs, right? Commodity prices were already weaker moving into 2025. Production costs shot up starting in 2022, 2023, 2021, and 2022. And so tariffs aren't the reason why the farm sector is struggling. It's the fact that production costs were very, very high and commodity prices are weak. They're not helping. I mean, that's one clear thing too. IEEPA tariffs, they make things more expensive on our supply chain. The retaliatory tariffs in China hurt our foreign demand. They make things, they weaken the commodity prices we receive. So they make the bad situation even worse, but they're not the main driver. And so that's the main summary I want to leave off with in terms of the trade policy side. I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions from the group.
Are there any questions? Feel free to unmute and come off camera. Oh, here's the question in the chat. How do you see this impacting the real estate market? That comes from Donald Martin.
Yeah, so farmland values, as we all know, they've been holding up pretty well. I mean, one thing I didn't talk about was government payments. And there, we've heard a lot of concern that the farm sector doing very, very um, struggling and farm income negative, and the government has to step in. So typically, I think the normal adjustment mechanism we see is that when the farm economy does very, very weak, is struggling, then typically what we do see is that that does pull back down production costs, and land is a big part of that. Now, one of the concerns that a lot of people have been worrying about is that we've had a very, very significant run up in terms of government payments over the past few years. Ad hoc support in terms of they had that market facilitation payment program in 2018 and 19. Then you had like CFAP during the pandemic period, ERP. Then you had ECAP, and of course now more recent we have the FBA, the Farm Bridge Assistance Program. And now they're even talking about another program on top of that as well. So the concern there is that are we keep on bumping up support for the farm sector? Does that therefore keep more operations going than they otherwise would? And is that one of the reasons why we've seen farmland values not weaken, perhaps as perhaps more than we've seen? Because if there's a weak farm economy, then typically we should see that reflected in weaker farmland values. We haven't. And so there is that concern that when you have these government payments, they get capitalized into the land values. And um, um, is that the reason why we haven't seen more of a pullback in terms of land prices? Perhaps. I mean, we have seen a very, very substantial amount of government payments over the past few years. Was there questions in the chat? I haven't really looked at that part. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Um, is there any other questions from the crowd?
Well, Dr. Arita, I was gonna come away with this knowing whether these tariffs have been good or bad. It sounds like some of them were needed anyway because of our markets were open for a long time over the course of the last century. Um, but still, I know a lot of farmers who are dealing with the struggles of the input costs and I know the government's collecting the tariffs, but the farmers aren't getting back proportionate share. I don't think. So, can you tell me? Can I sleep at night? Is this good? Is it bad? Or it remains to be seen.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I'm definitely not advocating for tariffs. Let me at least clarify that part. And that so I mean I would say that tariffs have significantly negatively impacted the farm economy for sure, without a doubt for there. Um, but also framing it in the sense where the farm economy, the farm sector has been collateral damage in this broader trade strategy where there has been, you know, areas that some of our trading partners have not been playing fairly. And um, you know, sort of the trade agenda, at least of this White House, has been, we have to bring back manufacturing. We have to reshore. That has been decimated over the past few decades due to trade. Now, on the flip side, agriculture has obviously benefited tremendously from trade, right? In terms of our exports to China, in terms of our exports to Canada and Mexico, and that has just been very, very important for farmers. Um, so farmers again, sort of seem to be in this unfortunate position where there's these other objectives at play, right? That are going on, and that, you know, again, for them, in terms of the broader economy, when they're talking about rare earth minerals or AI or other things too, all of these things are being subject to those negotiations. Um, Trade, free-flowing markets have, by and large, been a very, very positive thing for farmers. Um, so again, I think it's one of those where it's just um, trade again. It has these redistributive effects. It benefits some parties more than others, right? And so now when they're trying to rectify some of these issues, then are you going to be taking away some of these benefits that were clearly there to rectify other type of objectives? Um, and so again, across without by and large, again, tariffs have been very, very negative for the farm sector.
So, if we're going to enact tariffs, maybe instead of a sledgehammer, maybe a small hammer to do this.
I think that's a very, very fair um, um, critique, I think, for how this trade strategy has been running. The White House has seemingly started off very, very fast and furious, right? Move quick, break things. Um, and they just raised tariffs across the board. They have shown some signs of recalibration, I would say. I mean, they started to, they pulled back the fertilizer tariffs back in November. They've cut tariffs on food products that we import because now they're worried about inflation. And so I think there has been like just hit everything with a sledgehammer. Um, Obviously, these are very complicated um, um, areas to deal with, and having a scalpel approach would have been ideal. But yeah, they certainly have broke many things along the way in this strategy.
Dr. Arita, how do you see this impacting the prices for actual agricultural land? If in the short run, at least now we're seeing the farmers reaping lower profits, and if they can't hold on to their property, you would think that that is going to cause a run, so to speak. And there seems to be discussion in recent years that BlackRock, Gates, various foreign interests are buying up our farmland, and they might see this as an opportunity to buy land cheap, which will have long-term negative effects on our American farmers if they do so.
I mean, yeah. So let me caveat again. I'm not an expert in terms of land valuation. Um,
Mhm.
One area that I have been following more closely has been on the government payment side. I do suspect that, that in recent years, there's just been a lot more um, efforts into supporting farmers um, during challenging times as we're facing now. Now, this is needed. I definitely see that the FBA payments, for some farmers were very, very much necessary, but um, I think it does raise questions about the unintended consequences when you prop up, um, some levels of production and what that means to, uh, what that does to the input prices, including land prices in this. And so, I think typically in the long run, what you do see is that the farm income levels, the returns for land over the long run, equilibrate with the land values, right? I mean that's what I think for the long history we do see that. But when you do have government intervention, and that's what these government payments are, then you do have you can distort the market. And I don't know how much of an effect it has had, but I think that is part of the effect. I don't know so much just in terms of when you mentioned BlackRock or Gates or others, how that feeds into that as well, and the extent that that is driving what we're seeing in terms of the land prices. But um, strictly thinking in this topic of tariffs, again, at least what I'm seeing, just strictly when you look at the tariffs, well, part of the reason why they gave some of these government assistance was because they felt, well, the government was partly responsible for it because of the tariffs. And so by doing that, they therefore put more money back into the farmers, and that to some extent helps to get recapitalized back into the land. And so then you can have some kind of misalignment between normal market signals and and the normal values that you should be seeing in terms of these land prices. But again, I don't want to get too much because this is not one of my key areas of expertise.
Well, Dr. Arita, this is Mark Peterson. I'm the chair of the Farm Management Education Accreditation Committee, and we put these on. I greatly appreciate it. I don't know if anybody else has any more questions, but I greatly appreciate you taking time to present this information forward. It is very timely, and in particular, I appreciate the discussion on the Strait of Hormuz as well.
Yeah, no problem. It was a pleasure. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out, and happy to have any follow-up.
Yes, thank you again. Thank you everyone for attending, and we hope you will attend the next webinar in April. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.